Hello, everybody. This is a sort of initial review, or maybe an initial impressions of the Zowie ZA11-C. I've had the chance to game with this mouse for about 8 hours now, and I feel like after collecting my thoughts and writing some notes, I have a sufficient level of understanding of how I feel about and interact with this shape that I was able to put together a video that I was pretty excited about and would like to share with you guys. So, first things first, let's kind of just hammer some shape basics out, and I can start getting on to talking about why I care about them. So, the hump is quite tall and fairly far towards the back of the mouse. It's also fairly rounded, which is a little bit more unique among ambidextrous mice, especially ones with more rearward humps. To me, it feels quite similar just in the back, kind of from here back. It feels similar to a G703, except that this top part of the hump is wider and more gentle in its curvature, but the lower part and the angle this way of the hump feel very similar to the G703. It's narrower back here than the Makalu, and it's steeper than the MX518. Overall, this creates a quite consistent and obvious pressure center, slightly behind the highest point of the mouse, right about here, and that tends to contact just under my index and middle knuckles there. And then the pressure of the mouse against my palm spreads out pretty evenly in a circular fashion outwards, and the amount of pressure decreases the further that you get from that particular point. To summarize, or to give a good analogy for it, it feels like holding a ball, something around the size of a tennis ball in your palm. And as a result, it's not necessarily as comfortable as some of the other shapes that I have, but it's perfectly acceptable for a more aggressive claw grip in terms of how it pushes against my palm. It's not so thin as to be obnoxious the way the G703's hump is, being narrower towards the top. The other thing that I really like about this shape is that roundness to the hump, because it allows me a greater degree of flexibility in the wrist tilt that I use to hold on to it. A lot of ambidextrous shapes, or semi, inspired by ambidextrous shapes, I guess. So the Vaxi NP01, for example, but also the Zowie S2 that it was sort of based on, the Zowie FK1 Plus, the SteelSeries Sensei, and the G305 are all mice that I've tried, which I really struggled to get to terms with or feel comfortable with, because they were so wide and so sort of flat across the top of their hump that I really couldn't use the sort of wrist angle that I wanted to with those shapes. And to try and formalize, I guess, why that is, or why I'm in particular less comfortable with a totally flat wrist, it has to do with drag on the mouse pad. The two sides of the base of my palm here, if my wrist is totally flat against the pad, there's more pressure on this side of my palm than there is on this side. And that asymmetrical pressure reduces comfort, but also increases susceptibility to pad like slowing down or getting grainier with humidity. It makes my aim less consistent, because swiping left feels different than swiping right, because one direction, the skin that's being mashed into the pad tries to kind of fold under the edge of the mouse, for example, and it's just, anyway, so I don't really like that sensation. And so I tend to use a grip which results in even pressure between the two sides of my palm, which in practice requires a very, very slight tilt this way to my wrist. But again, very, very slight. And so a more rounded hump like this lets me use an ambidextrous shape with the type of wrist tilt that I want, and not feel like my comfort with the mouse is being significantly affected by doing so. The grippy matte coating on this ZA11-C, combined with the fairly steep and rounded hump, does change the way that I interact with the hump of the mouse in my palm. It's quite different to the Makalu, where I have the really, really flat palm, and I'm just pulling the mouse directly into what feels like a flat kind of backboard. It's a little bit too thin and a little bit too rounded for that, especially in order to extend my thumb enough to hit the front mouse button. And so I tend to push the base of my palm slightly further forward. But I can't go too far with it like I would with the 703, where I have a fairly sort of V-shaped grip, because the mouse is not as wide towards the front as the 703 is, nor is it as narrow at the back. And so I have to kind of find a compromise where the tension in my hand is more reminiscent of like the EC1C, where I do have curled fingers, but they're basically there just to flatten my palm out enough to accommodate the curvature of the mouse, rather than being a particular decision made to encourage a specific aiming style. The other thing is that because the coating is so grippy, when I try to push the mouse forward, I can't really free it from my grip easily the way that I showed doing with the Outset AX, for example, or even with the Makalu 67. And so that additional friction also creates extra friction between my palm and the hump back here on the backside, as well as when I'm trying to push it forward. And this means, unlike the Makalu, as you can see, the ZA11 is not trying to constantly escape from my grip. This means I don't have to aggressively and consistently pull the mouse backwards into my hand. And so if I'm choosing to do that as a deliberate aiming style to try and improve my performance in target switching activities, I can choose to do that, but it's not a necessity in order to accommodate this shape the way that it is with the Makalu. Simultaneously, I can push the mouse more forward like this, and when I do, my grip changes from more of a normal claw style with pretty good palm contact in this area to more of a pincer claw grip, where I'm really not touching it back there, and the mouse is being contacted here primarily, here at the base of my thumb, and then a little bit under these two knuckles. And that gives me enough freedom when it's pushed forward that I can do a fair amount of small corrections using sort of fingertip aim. And it's more reminiscent of the aiming style I use with the MX518. As you may have inferred from those last 2 points, part of the reason I'm excited about the ZA's shape is not only is it fairly comfortable as far as ambidextrous shapes go for me, but it allows me to use one basic grip and transition between 2 to 3 distinct styles of grip, which all perform better for different types of aiming without ever having to lift or actively readjust my grip on the mouse. I can go from a fairly relaxed, neutral sort of claw grip with relaxed fingers here with fairly minimal palm drag, and this is going to be useful for tracking, sort of arm-based tracking and longer flicks, like on the EC1C. I can push the mouse a bit further forward in my grip and have a greater deal of adjustment range to make small corrections and also do things like control recoil patterns. And this is more reminiscent of the MX518's grip style. Or I can pull the mouse all the way back into my palm actively and have it be better suited to wrist tracking or wrist flicking activities like I do with the Makalu. And so overall, I think that the ZA11's shape, or rather the shape of the ZA family, for me has quite a high potential ceiling, not necessarily in terms of my high scores in aim trainers, but my ability to take distinct styles of aiming that I have practiced and learn how to combine them into something that I can seamlessly transition between in a real sort of gaming setting, depending on how things are going or what type of fights I'm currently taking. And that's exciting because it has certain implications, I suppose, for the the potential of my aim. And it's, yeah, just been an experience which is nice to feel like there's some unexplored possibilities there again. So, one of my friends on Discord asked me to specifically go over the suitability of this shape for gripping with an extended ring and pinky finger. One of the common comments of the ZA is that the front is quite low, and there are concerns about ring and pinky finger space. With the ZA11, I found that conditionally not to be a problem. So, first of all, if I use the grip that I've been demonstrating for most of this, it doesn't particularly suit extended ring and pinky finger. And that's because this side of the hump, especially up here, is wide enough that I can't quite squeeze my pinky knuckle in as far as I want to get this whole finger to rest flush against the side of the mouse. It feels more like how the G Pro Wireless or the Cone Pro Air tend to feel when I'm using a more extended ring and pinky finger. What I can do is shift the mouse this way in my grip and then curl my thumb to accommodate how it's pushing more against this side of my hand. And that, as you can see, creates more space for my ring and pinky finger to sit along the other side of the mouse more naturally. And this works fairly well for more of a traditional palm grip like I use on the G703. You can see there's fairly flush contact with my thumb all the way around this curve, and additionally, my wrist angle is about where I want it to be. The palm contact is pretty reasonable, and overall, it's a fairly comfortable grip. All of that being said, I would rather, if this were thinner, it would suit this grip better, and that's why I think the ZA12 overall is a better size than the ZA11 for me. So I do have one on order. I will be getting a ZA12-C, and I'll be able to compare the size difference and see whether or not my gut feeling about the slightly thinner ZA12 being a better fit for my hands and grip style on it is accurate. But anyway, in terms of the placement and space for the ring and pinky finger towards the front of the mouse, as you can see, there is this ridge here, but also the trigger is entirely walled, the button is entirely walled off, like on the G703. And so despite looking fairly low at the front, there is a fairly decent amount of space for ring and pinky finger placement there. I don't really feel like they are particularly cramped any more than on something like the G703. The main thing is you can see the kind of upper edge of my ring finger tends to float above that wall rather than being totally mashed into it the entire height of the finger. The other thing that will happen is if I use this palm grip and my ring and pinky fingers are just relaxed, hanging onto the side of the mouse, then I don't have any issues with them dragging on the mouse pad or feeling cramped together or too squished or anything. However, if I start using those fingers to try and pull or push the mouse and help use them to adjust my grip and make small corrections this way, as I try to influence the mouse, I push those fingers against it, and it ends up squeezing them in a way that the bottom edge of the fingers droop down and make contact with the mouse pad. It doesn't end up being such aggressive contact that it really throws my aim off badly, but to go from not feeling any drag on the pad to suddenly feeling drag intermittently, depending on what your hand is doing, is a little bit odd. And so I would take that into account. Maybe if you have thinner fingers than me, that won't be an issue. But yeah, if you just like to extend your ring and pinky finger out and you don't really employ them in your aiming, your pure kind of arm and wrist aim, then they work perfectly fine for that. But if you want to use them kind of MX518 style to do small adjustments like this, then just be prepared for them dragging on the mouse pad a little bit. In terms of the shape, probably the last major things I have to mention are I love the low front of the mouse because of all the space it creates under my fingers. and I like the contact angle that my fingertips end up having with these buttons. But when I try to pull or push the mouse, I do tend to subconsciously get my index and middle fingers involved in that motion, and that can lead to accidental clicking sometimes because these buttons are not particularly stiff. And additionally, I find that my thumb is pretty cramped by the placement of these thumb buttons, and especially this quite soft mouse 4 is a target for accidental clicking as well. I wish these thumb buttons were placed higher, although I do have to say, in terms of how they sit in the cutout for them on the side of the mouse, they appear to be as low as I can possibly get inside of that hole. So maybe I can find a way to use a spacer or something to push them up towards the top of that cutout and maybe even round off the bottom edge of the buttons. And then they would be significantly more usable and provide a much nicer amount of space for my thumb to be placed naturally on the side of this mouse. So then, continuing on with the theme of discussing the buttons, the tensioning on all of them are good. There's no rattle or excessive pre-travel on any of them, and there's really not much to complain about in terms of sort of the build quality in that aspect. The action of the scroll wheel is a little bit loose between steps. Not as bad as my glossy outset, but sort of heading a little bit more that direction. Again, very difficult for me to say if that's just a quirk of this particular copy rather than a systemic difference between this smaller and slightly different design scroll wheel on the ZA series as opposed to the AC-C series. But I suppose I'll have a chance to help reinforce or disprove that suspicion based on what the scroll wheel on the ZA12 feels like. The scroll click itself is very nice, not too stiff, and I enjoy the tactility and amount of travel associated with using it. It's also not an issue really with scrolling on accidental clicking, although the slight looseness of the scroll wheel does make it more less confidence inspiring, I suppose, to avoid accidental scrolling than it might be otherwise. The main buttons are fairly light, slightly lighter than my EC1, I believe. And the tactile feedback from the right mouse button seems slightly lacking for my taste. Also, the buttons sort of tend to inevitably feel slightly mushy in the way that the EC1C's buttons do. But for some reason, I find it a little bit more obnoxious on the ZA11. But either way, I suspect that replacing the Huano black shell blue dots that this comes with KLGM8s will address that click feel and make them closer to something like the Makalu 67 or the MX518. As mentioned, the thumb switches are a little bit too soft. I wish they were slightly stiffer and noticeably more tactile. In addition to my gripes about the placement of them. Overall, they're certainly not the worst mouse buttons or thumb buttons that I've used, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement there other than the tensioning being quite good from factory. If I wanted to leave them exactly where they are, I would need to make them much stiffer so that I could rest part of my thumb on them with less worries about clicking them on accident. And then finally, the overall build quality. Well, being a Zowie mouse, it's pretty good. There's not any obvious creaking or flex from the shell. Nothing feels like it's loose or not meant to be there or somehow improperly attached. There's a little bit of that hollow click sound from the EC1, but given that there's a lot less sort of cavernous space inside this shell shape than there is on the EC1C, the hollow sound is not as bad. You can tell that it gets worse if I pick it up and don't have my hand resting on the mouse to sort of reduce those vibrations. But overall, really, yeah, not as bad as the EC1C, and just a very, very minor gripe. So yeah, that's my initial thoughts on the ZA11's shape. Again, overall, a pleasant surprise as far as ambidextrous mice go. Has some areas that I would really need to refine in order to make sure it worked optimally for me, but a shape that I think has a high potential sort of ceiling in terms of aiming capability, and one that I'm eager to try in a slightly smaller size and see how far I can go with it. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully that helped you get a better understanding of what this mouse is and who it might suit. If you do have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the comments. And please give a like on the video if it was helpful. Other than that, I plan on being back tomorrow with a review of the Razer ProClick. I know this video is getting quite long. I just wanted to acknowledge that right at the end. Thank you for watching all the way through. I was trying to cut it down and make it more brief, but unfortunately, I just had a lot of stuff that I wanted to say because it's, again, kind of a new experience for me. And I wanted to get as much of that across to you guys as I could. So for those of you who watched the entire thing, I love you. You're awesome. And I'll catch you guys at the next one. Take care.